Vikings are usually imagined as warriors and raiders, but that's only part of the story. In this video, we'll figure out where they came from and why this way of life took shape in Northern Europe. We'll talk about who the Vikings really were and why Viking wasn't a people but a temporary role. We'll see how ships and the sea made long-distance journeys possible, why the first attacks took Europe by surprise, and how raids gradually turned into settlement, power, and trade. We'll follow how the world changed and why at a certain point the Vikings stopped existing as a separate phenomenon, becoming part of a new European reality. Suggest new topics in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Here we talk about history, from ancient legends to modern tales, from historical facts to mysterious plots. Make yourself comfortable. We begin.
Scandinavia in the early Middle Ages was a place where a person was born into a world that promised no stability. The land rarely produced a surplus, the climate didn't allow long-term expectations, and life itself became a chain of decisions, each with immediate consequences. This wasn't the edge of the world and not a deserted backwater of Europe, but it wasn't part of the great political stage either, where power was felt every day. The North lived away from the large empires, yet it wasn't isolated. It moved to its own rhythm. For most of the year, winter set the rules. It arrived early, retreated slowly, and each time reminded everyone of the same truth. Any household survives on stored supplies, foresight, and agreement inside the community. Archaeology shows homes built for cold, wind, and long months of enclosed living. Longhouses gathered under one roof, people, animals, stores, and tools. That wasn't just an architectural choice, it reflected a way of life where the line between private and shared barely existed. Farming existed, but it never felt reliable. Even a good summer didn't guarantee peace because the next year could bring crop failure, disease, or the loss of livestock. In some parts of Scandinavia, archaeologists even see periodic contraction of settlements, signs of hungry years and forced movement. People left lived-in places not because they were chasing a better life, but because staying became impossible. In that world, the forest was the source of almost everything. Houses, boats, outbuildings, tools and weapons. Woodwork began early and followed a person through life. Metal was valued, but it remained scarce, something that required skill and exchange. Iron was often smelted from bog ore. The work was labor-intensive and depended on experience passed down within the kin group. That created a respect for craft and for those who held knowledge. The sea had a special place, but not as a symbol of adventure. For people along coasts and fjords, water was simply daily reality, a route, a source of food, and a way to stay connected to neighbors. Fishing, transporting people and goods, and seasonal voyages, all of it was ordinary. Even early burials contain boats and sea-related objects, which tells us the sea mattered long before the famous expeditions. The community was the basic unit of survival. Outside the kin group, a person was vulnerable because protection, help, and access to shared resources existed only inside stable ties. A chieftain wasn't a distant figure. His authority depended on trust and on people's memory. If he failed, if he led the community into losses, people could leave, support another leader, or split into smaller groups. Archaeology even shows large estates that suddenly stop being used and new centers appearing nearby. Power wasn't fixed forever. It demanded constant proof through action. This kind of order shaped a habit of responsibility and the understanding that status wasn't guaranteed by birth. Daily life was filled with labor and with shared living. Under one roof, people handled the household, argued disputes, raised children, and made important decisions. With so little personal space, reputation became crucial. Any breach of an agreement quickly became known to everyone. That created a dense social fabric where every act had consequences. Conflicts were common. Disputes over land, inheritance, insults, or harm done could grow into long, bitter feuds. But violence wasn't uncontrolled. Early legal traditions, later written down, already include systems of compensation and fines. That tells us there was an effort to keep society from tearing itself apart, to find ways back to agreement, even if the road was long. Belief and the sense of the world grew out of the same environment. The gods were seen as forces that took part in human life, but they didn't remove hardship. They might help, but they offered no guarantees. That worldview didn't promise comfort, but it explained a world where risk and loss were simply part of normal existence. By the 6th century, many Scandinavian regions were under internal strain. Population grew, resources were limited, competition between kin groups sharpened. Not everyone could find a stable place. The sagas, written down later, keep memories of people leaving home, not out of hunger for glory, but out of necessity. Stories of choices forced by life, not a path planned in advance. This was the world of the North before it became known to the rest of Europe. A world where the sea was familiar, the land was demanding, and the community was the only real form of protection. There are no Vikings here yet, not as a historical phenomenon. There are only conditions, slowly pushing people towards movement, risk, and the search for a way beyond the familiar world.
When we say the word Vikings, it sounds like the name of a people. We imagine a single community, united by origin, appearance, and way of life. But for the people of early medieval Scandinavia, the word meant something very different. It did not describe origin. It did not name a tribe, a country, or all northern people. To be a Viking meant to do something. It meant entering a particular kind of life, one that was not open to everyone. Most of the population of Scandinavia were never Vikings. They were born, lived, and died within the same region. They farmed, raised livestock, practiced crafts, and rarely traveled farther than a neighboring fjord or trading site. Their lives were tied to home, to the community, and to the rhythm of the seasons. They were the foundation of society. Without them, there would have been no expeditions, no fame, and no one later called a Viking. The word that gave rise to Viking in Old Norse languages links to going on a journey, to a seaborne venture, to a temporary departure from ordinary life. It was a condition, not a lifelong identity. The same person could be a farmer, a head of household, a participant in the assembly, and at some point in life become a Viking, then return, not as someone else, but as the same person back in ordinary life. Sagas and later chronicles preserve many such stories. People leave home not because they were born Vikings, but because circumstances demanded it. Land already divided among older brothers, conflict that forced someone to leave, the need for wealth to marry and start a household. Each decision was a response to a concrete situation, not devotion to an ideal. And it was never a solitary act. A voyage was always collective. It required agreement, shared risk, and divided responsibility. People gathered around a leader, but his authority was never absolute. He was recognized only as long as he fulfilled his obligations. Participation in a voyage did not erase old ties. A person remained part of their community. Absence was temporary. That is why the sagas so often emphasize the return, the sharing of spoils, and the restoration of ordinary life.
A voyage was an episode, important, but never the whole of existence. In this way, the Vikings were not a people, and not a single culture in the usual sense. They were a form of action, a response to pressure, scarcity, and the possibilities that lay beyond the familiar world. Seen this way, the Viking Age is not an invasion from outside. It is the continuation of their logic of the world.
For the people of the north, the sea did not begin beyond the horizon. It was always close. It entered everyday life as naturally as the forest, the pasture, or the hearth. The coastline was not a boundary. It was a continuation of the living space in which people made decisions, worked, and survived. That is why the ship in the Scandinavian world did not emerge as a luxury or a rare exception. It emerged as a practical answer to the conditions of life. Boats had existed in the north long before the Viking Age, but it was in the early Middle Ages that a form appeared which would later become the symbol of an entire era, the ship we know as the longship. The name itself is associated with carved dragon and animal heads placed on the prow, yet beneath this striking appearance lay something far more important, a carefully calculated structure, refined through generations of experience. The longship was built from wood, but not as a rigid construction. It was designed as a flexible, living body. The planks of the hull overlapped one another, allowing the ship to bend slightly with the waves instead of breaking beneath their force. The keel was shallow. This allowed the ship to sail both in open seas and in shallow waters. It could approach the shore directly without harbors, piers, or complex infrastructure. The ship could be pulled onto land, repaired, and launched again by the crew themselves. Building such a ship required collective effort. Trees had to be chosen carefully, the timber had to be shaped, fastenings prepared, the sail woven. This took time, skill, and resources. A ship was never built for a casual journey. It was a shared investment, a commitment. Its loss meant not only the loss of property, but the collapse of plans, trust, and future expectations. The sail held a special place. It allowed the wind to become an ally rather than an obstacle. Sails were woven from wool, treated with fats, reinforced with seams. This was demanding, time-consuming labor, most often carried out by women. Without this work, seafaring would have been impossible. Even when men went to sea, their journeys rested on the labor of those who remained behind. The longship was not enormous. It did not carry hundreds of people. It was not designed for endless voyages without stopping, but its size was precisely its strength. The crew could gather quickly, agree on a course, set out, and return just as swiftly. The ship was an extension of the community carried onto the water. Navigation relied not on instruments, but on attention and memory. Coastlines, river currents, wind directions, the behavior of birds, the color of the water. This knowledge was never written down. It was passed on through practice, through repetition. A mistake at sea was rarely forgiven. Experience was valued above all else. The longship was not created solely for war. It was a multi-purpose vessel. It carried goods, livestock, people. It served seasonal movement and communication between settlements. Only gradually did this same ship begin to be used for more dangerous ventures. The design itself carried no aggression. It offered possibility, choice. The ship changed how space was perceived. Distances shrank. Shorelines separated by water became neighbors. Rivers turned into roads leading deep into the continent. Life aboard demanded discipline.
There was no room for chance. Each person was responsible for the oar, the sail, the cargo, the balance of the whole. Conflicts did not disappear, but at sea they lost their meaning. Survival depended on coordinated action. Authority was proven not by words, but by actions in moments of danger. Over time, the longship became a symbol of what the sea made possible. It connected the world of the north with lands beyond familiar experience. At this stage, it was not yet an instrument of terror or conquest. It remained a tool of movement, a link between communities. For the people of the north, the sea did not begin beyond the horizon. It was always close. It entered everyday life as naturally as the forest, the pasture, or the hearth. The coastline was not a boundary. It was a continuation of the living space in which people made decisions, worked, and survived. That is why the ship in the Scandinavian world did not emerge as a luxury or a rare exception. It emerged as a practical answer to the conditions of life. Boats had existed in the north long before the Viking Age, but it was in the early Middle Ages that a form appeared which would later become the symbol of an entire era, the ship we know as the longship. The name itself is associated with carved dragon and animal heads placed on the prow, yet beneath this striking appearance lay something far more important, a carefully calculated structure refined through generations of experience. The longship was built from wood, but not as a rigid construction. It was designed as a flexible, living body. The planks of the hull overlapped one another, allowing the ship to bend slightly with the waves instead of breaking beneath their force. The keel was shallow. This allowed the ship to sail both in open seas and in shallow waters. It could approach the shore directly without harbors, piers, or complex infrastructure. The ship could be pulled onto land, repaired, and launched again by the crew themselves. Building such a ship required collective effort. Trees had to be chosen carefully, the timber had to be shaped, fastenings prepared, the sail woven. This took time, skill, and resources. A ship was never built for a casual journey. It was a shared investment, a commitment. Its loss meant not only the loss of property, but the collapse of plans, trust, and future expectations. The sail held a special place. It allowed the wind to become an ally rather than an obstacle. Sails were woven from wool, treated with fats, reinforced with seams. This was demanding, time-consuming labor, most often carried out by women. Without this work, seafaring would have been impossible. Even when men went to sea, their journeys rested on the labor of those who remained behind. The longship was not enormous. It did not carry hundreds of people. It was not designed for endless voyages without stopping, but its size was precisely its strength. The crew could gather quickly, agree on a course, set out, and return just as swiftly. The ship was an extension of the community carried onto the water. Navigation relied not on instruments, but on attention and memory. Coastlines, river currents, wind directions, the behavior of birds, the color of the water. This knowledge was never written down. It was passed on through practice, through repetition. A mistake at sea was rarely forgiven. Experience was valued above all else. The longship was not created solely for war. It was a multi-purpose vessel. It carried goods, livestock, people. It served seasonal movement and communication between settlements. Only gradually did this same ship begin to be used for more dangerous ventures. The design itself carried no aggression. It offered possibility, choice. The ship changed how space was perceived. Distances shrank. Shorelines separated by water became neighbors. Rivers turned into roads leading deep into the continent. Life aboard demanded discipline. There was no room for chance. Each person was responsible for the oar, the sail, the cargo, the balance of the whole. Conflicts did not disappear, but at sea they lost their meaning. Survival depended on coordinated action. Authority was proven not by words, but by actions in moments of danger. Over time, the longship became a symbol of what the sea made possible. It connected the world of the north with lands beyond familiar experience. At this stage, it was not yet an instrument of terror or conquest. It remained a tool of movement, a link between communities, a way to step beyond the known world without severing ties to home.
For Europe at the end of the 6th century, the world still appeared stable. Political borders shifted, kings fought one another, yet the fabric of everyday life remained familiar. Cities and monasteries lived according to their established rhythms. Trade followed known routes. Most threats came by land. Walls, watchtowers, and military thinking were directed inland. For this reason, the first blows from the sea were not immediately understood as the beginning of a new era. They were perceived as strange and frightening episodes, events that did not fit into the familiar picture of the world. The chronicles of the time struggle to find words for what was happening. They convey confusion, an attempt to explain something new using old categories. One of the first recorded shocks was the attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne. For contemporaries, this place held exceptional meaning. It was not merely a religious center, it was a symbol of order, prayer, and protection. The monastery stood by the water, yet the sea was considered a natural barrier, not a source of danger. The strike came from where no one expected it. The chronicles describe the event with an unmistakable sense of horror. They speak of suddenness, of screams, of blood spilled in a sacred place. But what mattered most was not the scale of destruction, it was the fact of intrusion, a violation of a boundary that existed not physically, but in the mind. After this, news began to spread along the coasts, to Ireland, to the Frankish kingdoms, to the northern regions of Europe. At first, these events were seen as exceptions, but then similar episodes began to repeat. The raids followed no schedule, they appeared suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. They left behind a sense of complete vulnerability. Monasteries became among the first targets, not because the attackers understood their spiritual meaning, but because these places were rich and poorly defended. They held precious metals, books, relics. Guards were few or entirely absent. For the Christian world, however, an attack on a monastery was perceived as an assault on the very foundation of order. The chronicles often interpret these events as punishment. Authors searched for causes in the sins of society, in weakened faith, in divine wrath. This reveals how difficult it was to accept that the new threat did not fit familiar explanations. The earliest raids were small in scale. They were not armies of conquest. They were swift strikes aimed at taking loot and leaving. Yet this very form was made them terrifying. The attackers did not stay, they did not negotiate, they made no demands. They appeared, struck, and vanished, leaving behind emptiness and fear. The sea played a crucial role. It ceased to be a defensive line. The coastline, once considered relatively safe, suddenly lay open. Rivers used for trade turned into paths of penetration. People who lived far from borders felt danger reach their own homes. The reaction of authorities was slow. Kings and local rulers did not immediately understand what they were facing. Traditional military structures were unsuited to an enemy that did not seek to hold territory. Raising an army took time, and by the time it was assembled, the attackers were already gone. This deepened the sense of helplessness. Sources begin to describe panic. People abandoned coastal settlements. Monks carry relics inland. Prayers and acts of repentance intensify. Fear spreads faster than the raids themselves. Even where no attack has yet occurred, it is already spoken of as inevitable. But for the participants in these early expeditions, however, events looked very different. This was not a clash of civilizations. It was a risky enterprise. Success was never guaranteed, yet perception on the other side of the sea created an image of a faceless enemy, an enemy with no name. This was how a myth was born, one that would live longer than the events themselves. The first raids did not destroy Europe physically, but they altered its inner sense of security. Sacred places proved vulnerable. The sea ceased to be a defensive line. This realization was the most lasting outcome of the first encounters.
The earliest raids were never intended to continue. They did not aim to seize land. They did not involve building houses or remaining for long periods. These were brief departures from the familiar world, after which people returned home. Yet over time, the very logic of these journeys began to change. This was not the result of a single decision, nor of anyone's deliberate plan. Conditions changed, experience accumulated, and the sense of what was possible slowly expanded. Those who went to sea increasingly encountered places where return was no longer the only option. Some coasts offered shelter, some lands were more fertile, some regions were weakened by internal conflict. These observations did not immediately turn into intention, but they slowly altered how the journey itself was understood. The sea ceased to be only a road there and back. It became a link between different points of life. One of the first steps towards settlement was the appearance of temporary camps. People remained on the coast longer than before. They repaired ships, waited for favorable seasons, or simply delayed their return. Gradually, these camps acquired economic functions, storage areas, enclosures for livestock, simple dwellings. The temporary began to take on features of permanence. This process unfolded differently in different places. In some regions it was slow and almost unnoticed. In others it involved violence and displacement, and elsewhere agreements and coexistence. The sources show that Vikings did not always arrive as conquerors in the strict sense. Sometimes they inserted themselves into existing power structures, supporting one ruler against another, receiving land or the right to settle in return. As this happened, the role of leaders changed. A man who once led only a voyage was now required to do more. He had to keep people together, distribute land, provide protection, and negotiate with neighbors. Military authority slowly turned into political authority. This transition was difficult. Power in the Scandinavian tradition was never absolute. It always demanded confirmation through action. Settlement also changed the people themselves. Those who stayed began to build families, to cultivate land, to construct houses. Life became less mobile, but more stable. This did not mean abandoning earlier experience. On the contrary, it was precisely that experience which allowed new territories to be held. The ability to gather quickly, to defend oneself, and to act collectively. In some regions, settlements gradually grew into towns. Their growth was slow, first points of presence, then centers attracting new settlers. Archaeological evidence shows how these places expanded and strengthened. They began to play a role in regional politics, no longer camps, no longer temporary, but stable communities with their own structures. For local populations, this process was experienced differently, sometimes as displacement, sometimes as coexistence, often as a gradual merging of traditions, languages, and customs. Gradually, Vikings ceased to be merely an external threat. They became part of political reality. They had to be negotiated with, accounted for, included in conflicts. This did not eliminate tension, but it shifted it into another dimension. Fear gave way to calculation and to the need to reckon with a new force.
Trade and long-distance routes formed a world that existed alongside raids, but followed a very different logic. For a long time, the image of the Vikings was shaped almost entirely by violence. Yet beyond the raids, another reality unfolded. A world of exchange, movement, and connection stretching from the Atlantic to the distant East. This world was not secondary. In many ways, it was trade that gave Scandinavian expansion its stability and its endurance far beyond the northern homelands. Trade was not something foreign to the north. Long before the Viking Age, Scandinavian communities were already part of networks that moved goods across great distances. Archaeology reveals glass, jewelry, coins, and everyday objects found far from major political centers. These finds speak of routes, contacts, and habits of exchange that existed long before the first famous raids. At first, these connections were irregular, fragile, dependent on seasons, trust, and chance. But over time, they shaped something deeper, an understanding of distance, value, and opportunity. When maritime expeditions became more frequent, trade gained a new rhythm. Ships that once served local needs began to link distant shores. Scandinavians did not create these systems from nothing. They entered existing networks and slowly expanded them. Silver became central, not as coin, but as weight, as substance, as universal value understood across cultures. Hoards found in Scandinavia reveal silver from the Islamic world and Byzantine, carried along rivers, portages, and sea routes that connected distant worlds. These routes were dangerous. They demanded knowledge, negotiation, and sometimes force. Yet trade required something raids did not: reputation. Agreements had to be kept, trust had to be earned, relationships had to endure. Through trade, Vikings became more than raiders from the sea. They became intermediaries, partners, and permanent participants in a shared economic world. Through goods moved not only wealth, but ideas, knowledge, and new ways of seeing the world. The North was no longer isolated, it was connected.
Faith in the world of the Vikings was not a separate part of life. It was not something turned to on special days or confined to temples and rituals. Belief was present everywhere, in decisions, in fear, in expectation, and in the acceptance of what could not be avoided. For the people of the North, the gods did not exist outside the world. They inhabited the same space in which humans lived, worked, and died. The Scandinavian vision of the world was not built around the idea of just reward. It did not promise that good would always be rewarded or that evil would inevitably be punished. Fate was understood as a force that existed independently of human will and even beyond the will of the gods themselves. This did not make people passive. On the contrary, the awareness of inevitability gave actions their meaning. If the outcome was not guaranteed, if the end could not be changed, then what mattered was the choice itself. The gods of this world were not all-powerful. They made mistakes, they argued, they suffered defeat, they even knew of their own destruction. Myths spoke openly of the end of the gods and the collapse of the familiar order. This knowledge did not destroy belief, it defined its character.
The gods were not guarantors of safety, they were participants in a shared journey, subject to the same laws of fate. One of the central concepts was honor. Honor was not a moral code in the modern sense. It meant meeting the expectations of the world, acting rightly in a specific situation without avoiding responsibility. To lose honor was to lose the very foundation of existence. That is why a person's choice mattered, even when the outcome was already known. Death was not hidden. It was present in stories, songs, and myths. Death was not treated as an exception, nor as a tragedy demanding explanation. It was part of the order of things. What mattered was not avoiding death, but meeting it with dignity. The afterlife had no single image. Different myths spoke of different paths. This reflected not confusion, but experience. Life after death did not cancel earthly life, nor diminish its value. It continued existence in another form, without promising compensation. Rituals played an important role, but they were never separate from daily life. Sacrifices, oaths, and rites accompanied decisions and transitions. These acts were not directed toward abstract ideas. They were ways of engaging with forces believed to be real and present. Faith did not rely on dogma. It did not demand correct belief, nor absolute agreement. Doubt was accepted as part of human experience. This is visible in myths where gods deceive one another, break promises, and face consequences. The world did not strive for logical completeness. It reflected the contradictions of reality. Knowledge of the future held a special place. Prophecies existed, but they were not meant to prevent fate. Knowing what lay ahead often intensified tragedy. Heroes knew their end and still moved forward. This was not seen as meaninglessness, but as strength of spirit. To accept fate did not mean submission. It meant acting with full awareness of the consequences. Mythology explained the world. It did not distract from reality, but helped make sense of it. Through gods and stories, people explained fear, loss, injustice, and unpredictability. The world was not seen as meaningful by default. Meaning was created through action. This belief was neither primitive nor chaotic. It was coherent in its view of existence. It did not separate humans from the world around them. Everything existed in a single field, governed by fate, which could not be cancelled, but could be faced with dignity.
If we set aside the sea, the ships, the raids, and the distant journeys, what remains is the world in which most people lived the greater part of their lives. This world rarely appears in chronicles. It almost never becomes the subject of legend. Yet it was this everyday life that formed the foundation of everything else. Most people were born, grew old, and died without ever traveling farther than a few days from their home. Their lives were shaped by labor, care for family, practical decisions, and the constant effort to maintain a fragile balance between need and possibility. The home stood at the center of this world. It was not divided into separate rooms in the modern sense. Space was shared. Life unfolded in full view of everyone. People ate, slept, worked, discussed disputes, and made decisions within the same walls. The hearth occupied the center, not only physically, but symbolically. Fire had to be kept alive. To lose it was not merely inconvenient, it threatened the survival of the household itself. Daily life demanded constant work. Farming, animal husbandry, preparing fodder, repairing buildings, making tools, producing clothing. None of this was secondary. Any mistake could have severe consequences during the winter months. Knowledge was passed on early and directly. Children joined work almost immediately.
learning by watching and repeating the actions of adults. The family was the basic social unit. Kinship determined obligations, protection, and a person's place in society. Marriage was viewed first of all as an alliance between families. It strengthened households, expanded networks, and created stability. Personal feelings were not excluded, but they were rarely the deciding factor. Far more important was mutual agreement and practical benefit. Women did not stand in the shadows of this world. Their role was essential to the existence of the household. They were responsible for internal order, distribution of resources, storage of supplies, and the upbringing of children. When men left for long journeys, it was often women who managed the household. Archaeological evidence and legal traditions show that women possessed real rights, including rights to inheritance and divorce. Marriage was not indissoluble. If a union ceased to function or became a source of constant conflict, it could be ended. This decision was not taken lightly, but maintaining order and stability mattered more than formal obligation. Domestic labor required no less skill than warfare or trade. Spinning, weaving, food preparation, preservation of supplies, all were complex and demanding processes. The quality of this work directly affected survival. Well-made clothing protected against cold. Properly stored food carried families through winter. Life followed the rhythm of the seasons. Summer brought movement and labor. Winter brought enclosure, reflection, and focus on the inner space of the home. During this time, stories were told, songs were shared, and memory was preserved. These were not abstract myths. They were stories of specific people, actions, and consequences. Life within the community depended on reputation. Support in difficult times relied on trust built over years. Conflicts were inevitable, but they were usually resolved in ways that preserved the fabric of shared life. Life between journeys was not a time of rest. It was a time of recovery, preparation, and waiting. The home was not the opposite of the road. It was its starting point and its meaning. Women also played a crucial role in preserving memory. Through them, family histories, ancestral names, and knowledge of the past were passed on. They were not only keepers of the hearth, but carriers of continuity, without which movement itself would lose its meaning. Daily life was not a grey backdrop to heroic deeds. It was the foundation without which raids, trade, and power could not exist.
Ages rarely end suddenly. They do not disappear in a single year, nor collapse because of one event. What we call the end of the Viking Age was not a defeat, not a catastrophe, and not a dramatic rupture. It was a slow and almost imperceptible process in which old ways of life gradually lost their necessity, giving way to new forms. By the end of the 10th and the beginning of the 11th century, the world in which the Vikings had emerged was no longer the same. Europe was changing. Kingdoms grew stronger. Systems of power became more stable. Permanent armies appeared. New forms of control over land and people took shape. Spaces that had once seemed fragmented and vulnerable began to tighten. Coastlines were no longer open. Rivers ceased to be uncontrolled routes. Sudden attacks from the sea became increasingly costly and less effective. At the same time, the north itself was changing. In Scandinavia, kingdoms began to form that sought permanence and predictability. Power came to rest not only on personal authority and military strength, but on law, taxation, and administration. This required a different relationship to war, movement, and risk. In a world where rulers aimed to control land and people continuously, the temporary way of life of the Viking became inconvenient and even dangerous. Christianization played an important role in this transformation, but it was not the sole cause. The new faith offered a different understanding of authority, obedience, and order. It reinforced the idea of centralized power and submission to the king as God's anointed. Yet conversion was not instantaneous. For a long time, old beliefs and new ideas coexisted, intertwined, and reshaped one another. For those who had once gone to sea as Vikings, the world became less open. Opportunities for free movement declined. Risks increased. Raids lost their effectiveness. Trade increasingly required permissions, agreements, and legal frameworks. A settled life began to offer more stability than constant danger. This shift did not happen through force. It happened gradually as choices adjusted themselves to new conditions. Slowly, the word Viking disappeared in its original meaning. It ceased to describe a living social role and remained only in the memory of chroniclers. Those who might have once called themselves Vikings became farmers, merchants, royal retainers, townspeople. They continued to live, work, trade, and fight, but within new structures and under different names. The Vikings did not disappear. What disappeared was the need to be a Viking. The world no longer required that way of life. What had once been an answer to circumstances became an anachronism. That is the true sign of an age coming to an end. Not the destruction of people, but the loss of meaning of an old form of existence. Yet the influence of the Vikings did not vanish. It remained in the land, in memory, and in the very structure of Europe. Many of the regions where they settled became centers of new states and societies. Their descendants entered elites, governed and shaped emerging worlds. The people of the North ceased to be outsiders. They became part of a shared European reality. The legacy of the Viking Age lives on in memory. Chronicles and later legends often distort reality, turning a complex historical process into a set of vivid symbols. But behind these images lies not savagery nor romance, but a story of adaptation, movement, and transformation. The Vikings did not seek to change the world, yet they found themselves at the center of its changes. Their age ended when the road ceased to be the only answer, when the home became more reliable than the journey, when power grew more stable than force. This was not the end of the North, and not the end of its people. It was their inclusion into a new order where past experience did not vanish, but became part of a more complex and enduring system. Looking back on the entire path, one thing becomes clear. The Vikings were not a deviation from history. They were its natural stage. They emerged from the conditions of their time and disappeared when those conditions changed. Their age ended, but their trace remained in the land, in memory, and in the very structure of Europe.